There we go. So let's kick off. So again, thank you very much for joining this webinar, which is exploring the boundaries between system resilience and individual resilience. So for those of you that were at the Resilient Healthcare Society meeting in Jönköping earlier this summer, the boundaries between resilient performance and psychological resilience, it was becoming a conversation that happened throughout the week, that they were increasingly blurred. It's also now discussed within the literature, and we see it in practice as our systems are becoming increasingly fragile as a result of staff burnout, moral distress, workforce shortages, etc. So we thought we'd hold a webinar this morning or this evening, wherever you are, to debate and discuss this topic. So we have two brilliant speakers today, which I'm delighted to introduce. So Professor Janet Anderson is going to highlight the importance of retaining a systems perspective for resilient healthcare. So she needs no introduction, I know, to all of you, but Janet's a professor of human factors in the Department of Anaesthesiology and Perioperative Medicine at Monash University in Melbourne. So her research aims to increase the quality and safety of care in all healthcare settings, drawing on human factors and psychological theories and methods. Most recently, her research focuses on developing methods for applying resilient healthcare to quality improvement, teamwork and communication. We then have Dr. Louise Ellis, who's going to argue for greater recognition of the role of individual resilience within our work. So Louise is a senior research fellow at the Australian Institute for Health Innovation at Macquarie University. She's a co-lead for the complex systems research stream that uses a complexity lens to approach issues of quality and safety in the delivery of healthcare. Her specific research interests are mental health services and systems, implementation science, and learning health systems. So the format is Janet and Louise are both going to give short presentations to us all. And we've promised them that this isn't going to be a Q&A directed particularly at them. The idea really is that it's going to be an extended discussion between all of us about the possible benefits, limitations, consequences, etc. of blurring these two different phenomena. So please chip in and contribute your thoughts, pose questions to the group as well, and yeah, chip in as much as you like during the discussion at the end. Hopefully we'll have a good amount of time to do that. So unless anybody has any questions or anything that I've forgotten to say, I'm going to shut up now and hand you over to Louise, who's going to kick us off properly.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, Ruth. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen. Can everyone see that? Great. And I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the lands on which we gather today, whose deepening connection to culture and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the dream time. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging for their immense spiritual connection to place, which was never created, and to the land and water, its knowledges, dreaming and culture embodied within and throughout this country. Sorry, guys. So why are we here talking about this issue today? We're exploring the boundaries, or the muddied boundaries, between system resilience and individual resilience. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused a significant disruption to our health systems for almost 3 years, with actors within the system. Sorry, I'm just going to try, and I've just got a little bit of an issue here. There we go. Sorry about that. With actors within the system having to maintain system performance, and with the resultant effect of burnout and mental health issues amongst our healthcare workers. And why have I been invited to talk about this issue today? Well, I'm a psychologist by training. So the idea of exploring the relationship between system resilience and individual resilience is particularly interesting to me, and it's an area that I'm quite comfortable considering and debating. So I'd just like to start with a bit of a history lesson in terms of the definitions of resilience. So the word resilience originally came from the Latin word resilla, which means to bounce back. And in science, the term resilience has long been used by engineering to describe the ability of a material to absorb energy without losing its original form or characteristics. And over time, different disciplines adopted and adapted the term, adding different interpretations and facets to it. So in psychology, resilience is understood as the individual human capability to cope with crises, losses, or hardships without negative consequences. And in terms of health systems resilience, scholars have been calling for greater conceptual clarity and empirical rigor for years. And in part, this is because resilience is a complex and puzzling concept to study. It is ambiguous, it is multi-layered and dynamic. And Biddle et al. In their systematic review identified that across the many definitions, health systems resilience can be defined as the degree of change a system can undergo while maintaining its functionality. Oh, what is my computer doing? So Siri Wigg and her colleagues at the Share Centre in Norway have updated this definition and define resilient healthcare as the capacity to consistently deliver safe, high-quality care through adaptations at multiple system levels in the faces of challenges and disruptions. And if you consider resilience from a multi-level perspective, of course, we can think of individuals as being nested within teams, which are nested within organisations and are nested within the broader health system. And if we think of this from a complexity lens, of course, individual agents are part of the system. So what is the research saying? Myself and my colleagues from the Australian Institute of Health Innovation conducted a systematic review back in 2019, and we identified that empirical research in this area is limited but growing. And we also found limited research has been conducted across multiple system levels, which most of the research being conducted on clinical microsystems at the sharp end. So really at that sort of team level end of the system. I'd like to just briefly summarise a study that I conducted a couple of years ago, which has helped me shape my thinking in this area. This study was based on a secondary analysis of qualitative interview data collected during the implementation evaluation study of the Lifespan Initiative. And the aim for my work here was to identify characteristics of resilience at different system levels. And for this, we used the Berg and Assay framework to map the characteristics of resilience from the transcripts. But what really came out from these interviews, that there are potentially negative outcomes of resilience. And Kaza et al. Said they described this as the dark side or downside of resilience. So what started out as resilient work practices over time led to stress and burnout in a number of personnel. And these findings are particularly relevant to the COVID-19 pandemic, which has disrupted all system levels and resulted in widespread mental health issues and burnout that we'd all recognise. And so as a result of this, I've started to think about these issues and developed a multi-level model of systems resilience to assist really with future research design and analysis. So I'm thinking of systems resilience as a multi-level perspective with the individual at the centre, but I'm also wanting to look at what are some of the positive and negative outcomes of maintaining systems level performance. Some of these negative outcomes could be stress, burnout, decreased job satisfaction on the individual level. So just to make a few final points, I'd like to argue the case that resilience is a multi-level phenomenon with the individual at the centre. Kaiser et al., they argue that individual resources and capacities are coordinated to form group and organisational level resilience. So the relationship between the individual and the broader system level resilience. I'd also argue the case that we should be looking at both the positive and negative outcomes of resilience and look at how then they impact on other levels within the system. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise. That's brilliant. Really good introduction to the topic. Thank you. Shall we move swiftly on to Janet and then we can have a discussion amongst everybody? Thank you, Janet. Janet, you're on mute.
Okay, finally, after 15 clicks, I'm unmuted. Thank you. Well, thank you, Louise. That was great introduction. Not sure I can match it, but I'll try. And thank you for inviting me. And it's wonderful to see so many people, many of whom obviously we know in person, and it's just great to continue this connection with everybody. So I'm going to try and just I guess, pose some discussion topics and try and be a little bit provocative if I can. I'll try. The first thing I want to start with is thinking about theory and why it's important. I think it's really important to use theory as much as we can in our work because it is a tool for thinking about a problem and how to change it. It allows us to do lots of things. It allows us to name and explain what we observe. It allows us to explain relationships between concepts. It helps us to bring about change and identify what we don't know. And so it's very helpful in terms of guiding research and developing knowledge, including knowledge about how we can apply the findings from an individual study or project in other times and places. And why am I telling you all this about theory? Because I think I'm going to argue really that the most important thing about resilient healthcare is its basis in the theory of complex adaptive systems. And I'm hopefully going to persuade you of that as we go along. So what does it mean to say that healthcare is a complex adaptive system? Probably we all know this already, but I'll just go over the main points. It's basically, we look at healthcare as a series of interconnected elements that interact in multiple, multi-layered, non-linear ways. And the things that are included as elements within this complex system, they can be many things, but people, obviously, organizations, networks, policies, social environments, cultural ideology, and so on and so forth. And the key thing in a complex adaptive system is that it does adapt. It adapts to the environment that's dynamic and changing and variable. And that means that the behavior of the system changes over time as that behavior emerges in response to environmental pressures or challenges or changes. And that emergent behavior involves interactions between all the system elements. And it means that we can't understand the the whole of that complex system by focusing on one element only, because the elements are all connected. And it also means that we can't fully specify the system or control it. And it means that the effectiveness or otherwise of whatever changes we might want to introduce can't be fully predicted, and that may be non-linear. We may find effects happening in different times and places, quite removed from the time and place in which we introduce the change. And so a complex system basically means that we have to change. If we start to view healthcare in this way, we need to change the way we approach understanding it and trying to improve it. So what do we need to do in order to do that? Well, first of all, we need to identify the system and its boundaries. And I think this is obviously, well, not obviously, but I think this is often a place where we fail to really rigorously define what it is that we're studying. So we need to really identify the system that's within our ambit and its boundaries, and study the phenomena that we're interested in the real world. And this is a huge strength of resilient healthcare work, is that we pretty much without exception study phenomena in the real world, which is hugely challenging and hugely valuable, because it enables us to really understand what makes the system behave in certain ways. It enables us to examine those wider influences and causal pathways. It is challenging because it means we're taking this holistic view, not a reductionist view. But I think the important thing to acknowledge here is that what we're trying to do when we're doing this is really think about how we can shift a system towards more desirable behaviour patterns. We can't control it, we can't specify it, we can't predict exactly what's going to happen, but we can try and create the fundamental conditions that might start to shift a system towards more desirable behaviour patterns. Now, remember, as we said, that systems are dynamic and will respond to changes. And so this implies also that we need to keep monitoring that system to understand how it changes in response to what we've introduced. One of the things that's been particularly a strength of resilient healthcare, I think, are the methods that we've used for understanding this complex adaptive system that we call healthcare. There's been lots of different approaches used to system mapping and modelling, and you can see a couple on the right there, or the left, or whichever side it's on, a FRAM model and a cognitive work analysis model. And also a lot of resilient healthcare studies rely on a qualitative analysis of the interactions between the system elements, which is a huge strength, because that's not a straightforward thing to do when you have to take into account all of these elements that interact. There's been very little within our community, I think, in terms of simulating system performance and trying to predict from that, but that is an avenue that we could explore further. I think we touched on it slightly in Jönköping. But the basic, fundamental part of this, I think, is that for resilient healthcare, the system has to be the unit of analysis. We're interested in trying to optimize systems on the basis of this in-depth understanding that we're developing. And so it's the system that's the unit of analysis, not individuals within it, or in fact, any one element within it. We're trying to develop this holistic view of how the system works. And so I think this is pretty fundamental to our approach. So what does that mean? There's a whole lot of theory for you, but what does that actually mean for individual resilience? I mean, as Louise said, people are obviously one element of a complex system and are clearly important for system functioning, especially we can see now with people leaving and the system being incredibly stretched and changed beyond recognition in some places because of staff shortages and resource problems. But I think what we really need to keep in mind is that individual resilience is an outcome of the system design. The extent to which individuals can compensate for poor system design is actually embedded in the system and affected by the system design. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is that relying on individuals to adapt and cope, I think, is morally dubious when we know that systems are poorly designed and create huge amounts of pressure on individuals and teams. And we could also argue that it's self-defeating because it doesn't solve the original problem, that is that people are stressed and burnt out and they're leaving. So I would argue that really the level of analysis is what distinguishes this systems approach. And if we want to take a systems approach to individual resilience, we probably can, but we need to change the question in some way to think about how we can, first of all, design systems better so that they don't stress people and don't demand individual resilience at this level, but also to think about how we might support individuals to be more resilient at the system level, not through individual training or skills, but at the system level. So that means we might need to think much more broadly about how technology could support them better, how we might reduce demand, how we might increase the effectiveness of team working and leadership, both of which have been shown to be protective of stress and burnout. So I think this is my last slide. I just wanted to go on to think a bit more about the future for resilient healthcare, because this is related to my ideas about systems perspective. And I think the first thing is that we need to be really mindful of the historical development of resilient healthcare. It is very young. And as Eric said a few conferences ago, we are at the end of the beginning of resilient healthcare. We've spent this time, however long it is, a decade at least, debating and trying to agree upon the core concepts. And I think now is the time for us to really double down on that in a way and say, well, this is what resilient healthcare is about. And so that we can focus and keep developing those core concepts, because they're not simple to apply. So I would argue that we would be better served. I told you I was going to be provocative, but I would argue that we would be better served to think more about a systems perspective than to start thinking about individual resilience. And to do that, we need to think more about developing methods. We already have some methods, but there are lots of other things that we could start to think about. And I think we have to be much stronger in terms of arguing for the benefits of understanding the real world as it is in reality, in order to inform better intervention design and evaluation, because doing that will increase the sustainability of our interventions, hopefully avoid quick fixes and the waste that's often involved in this kind of cycle of constant improvement that doesn't really improve. And then along with that, I think we have to avoid using the word resilience as a kind of catch-all phrase for anything that affects performance. So I think we have to be, I'm a little bit of a purist, so I guess I'm arguing that we need to be very clear about what it is that we mean by resilience, and not start thinking that, you know, because I don't know, there's a million things in healthcare that affect the performance of the system, but not all of those things. It's not helpful. I suppose that's the issue. It's not helpful to think about those things as being part of resilience. I like to think of, in terms of a systems approach, of us moving beyond reliance on individuals to solve problems, and to think about structural flexibility in the system. So we want the system to flex, so we need to put in place mechanisms for it to do that, but it needs to be structured. So I think paradoxically in healthcare we have a kind of combination of things that are too lax but also don't work very well, and are too inflexible. And my final point, I think, is that for resilient healthcare, I think we need to really maintain, and I'm not suggesting that we're not, but I think this is a really important point, that we maintain a critical perspective on what we're doing and really start to think in terms of a critique of the way society manages healthcare and the way policy responses are developed, the way organisations are set up, professional groups and so on, and also to start to critique how these organisations are managed, because I think we really need an ongoing adaptive management response rather than a kind of, you know, as we've talked about before, this idea that you can go in and fix problems one by one. What we're talking about, I think, when we're talking about resilient healthcare is this ongoing management of systems by understanding work as it is done and ensuring that we keep close to that and that we understand the demands and so on. So that's all just a fairly long-winded way of saying that I think the systems approach is our strength, and I think that we should maintain it. And I think that individual resilience can fit into that, but not if it involves studying individuals. And I shall finish there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Janet and Louise, for some great presentations and really getting us thinking about this topic. I don't know if you want to stop sharing, Janet, and then we can, or everybody can see each other. Do people have any comments, questions, things, points they want to raise? Things that they got thinking about as the presentations went on?
I think there's a couple of hands up.
Oh, Carolyn, do you have your hand up?
I do, and I want to go back to something that Janet, you said early on in your presentation, which is the importance of defining boundaries. What do we mean when we say system? Could you revisit that? One of the concepts that I think about a lot is the extent to which thinking about a system is thinking about relationships, the tensions among components, the connections among components. But I want to hear what you have to say, what you meant, you know, what was in your mind when you were talking about that definition of the boundaries. Thanks.
Yeah. Hi, Carolyn. Thanks for the question. I think you're absolutely right. It's about connections and interactions, but we can't study absolutely everything at the one time. And so I think we have to be much clearer about selecting what's within our scope, if you like, and what is outside our scope, and better at defending that in a way. Because, so an example is one of the very first studies that I did in resilient healthcare quite a long time ago now, nearly 10 years ago now, focused on the emergency department. And we were very deliberate in terms of putting our boundary around that department and excluding things that were outside that, even though we knew they were connected. So the wards to which people were discharged was outside our scope. The ambulance service that brought people to the door was outside our scope. The GP who referred, that was outside our scope. So we were very clear that we were only looking within that boundary. And we were obviously criticised for that, but I actually don't think that was a weakness, because it meant that we could go into a lot of depth with our analysis of what was happening there. And it also meant that we could start to get an idea of what lay outside the boundary in our in-depth discussions within. So we got hints about other areas that we could follow up, and in fact, which we did follow up in subsequent studies. But if we'd started off with that huge scope, I don't think we would have managed to successfully complete the project, really. And there's been another project that I did was looking at end-of-life care across a whole county in England. And that made me kind of gulp to think that we were going to do that, because it was enormous. But what it meant was, the trade-off was, we could only do it at a very high level. And we had, you know, all sorts of in-depth system mapping and all sorts of stakeholder input, but it was at a very high level because we were covering the breadth. And so I think one of the things we need to do is get it, maybe be a bit more explicit, if you like, about the trade-offs that are involved in those decisions. Yeah.
We have some questions in the chat. Is Robin here? Do you want to say something? It's kind of long, so maybe.
I think, is Robin travelling?
She's
Might not be able to
traveling.
come on. What does she say?
Should we read it out?
Yeah, go for it.
Should you? Will you do that, Ruth?
Yeah. So Robin's saying, I think the views of both Janet and Louise are compatible. Individuals are a critical component of the system. In fact, they're ones who are flexing and adjusting and contributing to system behaviour. Looking at the individual perspective is an extension of understanding work as done. In fact, we are starting to code sign systems with people to make them more effective. I'm not sure what sign systems are. Does anybody?
And it's another additional
Code
comment.
design.
Yeah.
There we go. It's a typo.
Yeah.
And obviously the boundary will depend on the question. And I think that is definitely a tension, is trying to, it's a trade-off, isn't it, as to where you set that system boundary. Does anybody else have any questions or comments?
I just wanted to say, yeah, I definitely agree that I think the viewpoints are compatible. What I'm saying is totally compatible with what Janet's saying. And I totally agree that we need to be better at defining what the boundaries are. And I liked what Janet said in terms of thinking of individual resilience as perhaps an outcome, which is essentially what I was suggesting as well. And yeah, it all depends on what the question is and what level of the system we're actually looking at, and being clear about that. I think that's what's really important. I think one of the issues is that the methods that we're currently using in resilient healthcare tends to involve individuals within those methods. So as a byproduct, perhaps we often get information that's related to individual resilience at times. So it does muddy the waters. Perhaps we need better methods in terms that don't always involve the actors within the system. And I think that is happening. But I don't know, what's your viewpoint on that, Janet?
I agree with you. I think that's absolutely right. And that's all really important to understand that from individuals. And it's actually, from a kind of researcher point of view, it's great fun because you find out all sorts of interesting stuff. But I agree. I think there's scope to approach it in a different way. So we did a study also some time ago now that looked at gathering administrative data across the hospital to help us to start to model system performance. It was a bit of a nightmare project, I have to say. But it was really interesting because you can start to see where the pressures are in the system and what people have to adapt to, even though you haven't spoken to them, because you can see the effects on the performance from the quantitative data. So it would be really cool to do some more of that kind of research, I think.
I would like to invite Ellen. Do you want to say something?
I just have a question, because I have for a long time I'd really wanted to map the arenas for interaction between the different elements of a system, and I was wondering if anyone has a method for that. I'm thinking like the interaction between doctors across departments and across, for example, between the ED and the ward. Because I think that arenas for dialogue, not just the spontaneous dialogue, but for regular dialogue about how cooperation happens, could be related to how well the system, how resilient the system is. So it would be really interesting to have a kind of systematic method for doing that.
And now in the chat, people are suggesting many methods here. System dynamics can work for this purpose. Siri has studied reflective spaces, social network analysis. And we have a longer comment from Ellen. Do you want to say something, Ellen?
Sure. I hope you can hear me. It's great to see everyone, and thank you both for the presentations. It's 1:30 in the morning here in Philadelphia. But what I'm wondering is what part of what's important is understanding the boundaries of whatever system you've chosen, because that inherently it provides a certain perspective and has inherent limitations, sort of like shifting a gem with different lenses. So just knowing what the capabilities and limitations of the boundaries perspective based on the boundaries is.
I completely agree, Ellen.
Miriam, you've had your hand up for.
Yes, I'm kind of going back to you, Janet, and that to say that we have to be clear about what we mean with the resilience, and I think about what do we really mean. I don't know if you have seen the article by Amal Berti, who made this game with deep water fishermen, where he claimed that resilience is not normative. It's not good and bad, and he was playing this card game where the fisherman got the options that fish is coming in front of you, but it's also coming in a hurricane. And the safe behavior would be to go to the harbor and stay until the hurricane has passed. But the resilient behavior was to go for the fish. And how does this? How is this relevant for healthcare? I think during the COVID-19 pandemic, the resilient behavior was to stretch beyond your forces just to save the situation and so on, but it was not the safe behavior for the personnel. And also that we're talking about people, individual resilience on the floor, on the sharp end, but resilience, people are also in the blunt end, and management is resilient behavior among managers is not so much discussed. How do they behave resilient? What is resilient in that context? So this is a lot of questions, but I just give you them and see what you reflect upon. What is resilient? What do we mean with resilience? Is it safety, or is it something that is kind of dangerous, being at the edge of chaos?
I think that's really interesting. That's got me thinking of Siri's resilience for what, for whom, for when model, in terms of something that might be resilient in one particular moment, actually longer term for an individual might not be resilient, and there you see the individual resilience as an outcome of that system potentially being poor. Siri.
And I can actually see Siri's holding her hand up, so
You can talk about that model far better than I can.
Would you like to say something, Siri?
Yeah, I can say something. It was not about that. It was just I wanted to say thank you to both speakers for brilliant presentations, and I think it was a really good match. And I was thinking of when you, Jan, said we have to think about the theory, what's kind of our foundation, and also that made me think about the model that you, Louise, showed, because for me that is not kind of an individual resilience model is trying to understand how the system influences those people working in it, and how we should create conditions under which people work that is, and how that actually influences them. So for me, that made really, really good sense in my head, also as a kind of a theoretical link between these individuals. This model for me does not say that the individuals should be responsible for the system, and I think that is more just showing how we have to create a resilient system, and that means also taking care of the workers in the system for me. So I just wanted to say thank you for that, both of you, and I think your suggestion, Janet, of we have to keep a systems perspective, and I totally agree, and I think you can do by also having all the elements of the system included in such a model. Of course, difficult to rationalize it, but I think this is kind of for me, it was really interesting to listen to you both. So just want to say thank you, and I don't have any answers or questions, more just applause you for great work and bringing us together.
We also have Magali. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, I was just, thank you again for your presentations. I was more curious about the purpose of, if the purpose of the subsystems are aligned with the overall system or not, and whether this was the cause of those challenges. I don't know if you have this angle, if you've thought about this angle, and whether you've know about critical systems heuristics, which is something that can help also with boundary critique and looking at the boundaries in terms of who's in power, with the power relationships and other things that can help you define the boundaries of your system. Just curious about but the purpose in particular, I was particularly curious about it, whether you've looked at it from in your studies.
Thanks for flagging it up, because no, I haven't looked at it, but I will now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
But I guess there's this is so much the case with this area, is that we have to be careful how we use language, I suppose, because I'm wondering what we mean by boundaries now. I was talking about the boundary of my investigation, but I'm wondering whether you're now talking about the boundary between elements of the system, which of course is a slightly different thing, which is also important to understand. Yeah. But it's quite interesting, isn't it, the way language can help us, but also obscure us. And I think we have to be very vigilant about explaining what we mean by many of these concepts. But thank you for flagging that up, because I will have a look at it.
Yes, I will too. Thank you for that suggestion. But I totally agree with Janet. Language is so important. And we did discuss this at the conference, how resilience has become a dirty word. And if we do try and suggest that individuals within the system are the ones who need to be resilient, then we have a problem, because all the blame goes onto them. So that is the problem. And I think Janet and I both fully agree that we need to focus on the system and make sure that the system itself can enable resilient performance then we have healthy and happy workers in the workplace, and of course happy patients as well. So it's not that the focus needs to be on individual resilience.
Lev, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in?
I'm not sure he heard you. Lev, are you there? Do you hear us?
Yeah. Nice to see you all. Very pleased. It's a good time in New Zealand, 7:45 p.m. So it's very lovely. So yeah, from clinical perspective, 2 comments. First, what we defined in the healthcare resilience studies as the illusion of control very often driving senior management for easy to fix solutions, which means the thing, if we run individual training, if we'll run half-an-hour sessions about mindfulness, we'll increase resilience. However, it's opposite. It will create illusion of control for managers, an illusion of control for employees, and then it will drive over resilience and burnout. Because the main question, how can increase understanding, system understanding from sharp end and blunt end? Because without understanding, we can't redesign systems, and we can't really drive personal resilience. An illusion of control, based on like my experience of my colleagues, it's a main danger, because it can give us false security that by training we can achieve resilience, and however we'll ignore system failures or system faults. It's easier to invite someone and pay a lot of money for like 5 sessions of individual resilience training and be very happy about it, and however it will drive absolutely to nothing. So big question, how we can actually create a shared culture of understanding and burst this bubble of illusion of control from both sides, which is a main issue, which in many ways relates to what Carl is saying about people as solution. Systems need to be easy to understand. We must make it easier to do the right thing, but we can't do it if we don't know systems we manage and people we manage and support as well. It's my short feedback.
Thank you so much, Lev. Carl, did you want to come in?
Hi, Ruth. Sorry I'm late. There's someone put up a clinical question about how resilient individuals, make a more resilient system. I guess there's one of the things that struck me in the last little while looking at this issue has been about this idea, if you think about adaptive capacity, is that we kind of load the adaptive capacity onto the front line. And so we kind of load the whole of the system resilience onto the front line. And I think that's one of the issues. And there's quite a significant literature on neoliberalism with responsibilization and abandonment. And I kind of think that's what we've been doing, is kind of we make you responsible for the system. And then if you don't do yoga, then we hold you accountable for, why you're not more resilient. And I kind of think that's a form of abandonment from a managerial or from a structural point of view. So I think there's quite a lot of issues about this, how we sort of hold individuals responsible for system adaptability, but also for system, for being the solution to burnout as an individual solution, which is a very neoliberal concept, as opposed to this much more sort of people in systems kind of approach. So my gut feeling is that resilience is a system property. It has to be a whole of system property rather than an individual one. So that's my take on it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carl. Torben, you've got your hand up as well.
Yes. I think it seems like we are becoming ideologists when we talk about these things. I very agree on the concern that we should put too much responsibility on the individual, and that the critique may have to be on management more to change systems. But when we only talk about systems, it can also be quite abstract. So, and it also seems like that we become a little bit linear in our thinking, that the individual resilience can only come from systems resilience. It's like one way. So I think that it may not have to be, we have to be aware that if it's ideology that steer our research questions. If our research goes in the direction that individual or psychological resilience is relevant even to systems resilience, then I think we should be looking at it. That's my point.
Thank you so much, Torben. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
I think Bruce has a comment in the chat. Is he here? No. And we also have Ellen.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, I'm not muted. It's very interesting what you're saying, Torben, and I think maybe a reason for us to thinking, trying to protect the system perspective is because it's so central for the patient safety approach, since the individual role has always been there, but it's the system's awareness of the system part which is fairly new, and that's why we are very concerned about it, and need to preserve and explore that more, perhaps than we're more concerned with exploring that than the individual perspective. But of course, you're right, the individual is part of the system, and I think that's also come through in what has been said. Thank you.
Karina.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on this notion of why individuals adapt, because that might be very different, and it might mirror the system in a way. So I think we shouldn't be too afraid of studying individual resilience, because people adapt to, for example, hospital standardization practices in very many different ways. They adapt, they have emotional reasons, they have motivational reasons, they have a set of reasons for why they adapt to, for example, hospital standardization. And we're working on a scoping review to go through the literature on more of the individual reasons for adapting, and I think that those reasons or those factors mirrors the system in a way. So I think we shouldn't be too afraid of looking at individual resilience within the system, within the system resilience perspective. And I think it's difficult with, I think it's more difficult with the boundary discussion, because I think it's very difficult sometimes to set boundaries around things, because then we kind of go a little bit back to not the complex adaptive system theory. We go into something that's more linear, perhaps. I'm not sure.
Thank you, Karina. Janet, you looked like you wanted to come say something.
Yeah, thanks. I think at the risk of kind of repeating myself, I think that we need to be really careful about language, because when we're talking about, and I'm looking at Chris's comment there, which is really interesting as well and spot on, when we're talking about individual resilience, we can either be talking about that person's individual resilience to stress and burnout, which is where I think we started, or we can be talking about their contribution to the system adapting through their own actions, their adaptive actions. And I think that's obviously part of the system. Although I think also that we need to elevate our analysis to the system level, taking into account individual actions. But the individual resilience to stress and burnout, the psychological resilience, is a completely different issue, I think. Or maybe it's just me that's confused. I'm not sure.
I'm very conscious of time, but it feels like that's not the place to leave it in Torben.
Yeah, I was just thinking maybe we should distinct, which some researchers do, between psychological resilience and individual resilience, where psychological is the burnout thing and coping thing, while individual is how you get back to contribute to the production of patient safety. a suggestion.
Thank you, Torben. Does anybody have any final comments or questions that they want to pose? Go on, Janet.
Can I just come back on that point? I think that's a really good distinction, Torben. But I think, you know, bearing that in mind, we still have to focus on the system. So how does the system support people to do that? Because not everybody's going to have that ability right from the start. Some people are just graduated. Some people have been there for 40 years. So, you know, people are going to have different abilities. So I think it still comes back to how does the system support that to happen? And that's what our focus, in my opinion, should be on, really.
It's a lot going on in the chat as well, and it feels like we could probably debate this for another few webinars in the future. But we are going to have to draw it.
I just wanted to say that I'm quite excited with some work that I'm doing with Robin, Clay Williams and Siri as well for next year, where we're going to be looking at some of these issues around the interplay between system resilience and I guess what I'd call those kind of individual kind of outcomes like burnout, job satisfaction, intention to leave, some of those sort of issues. And I'm really excited about that. And these particular hospitals that we're working with recognise that they don't want us to introduce another kind of wellness program to improve their resilience or well-being. They recognise that we need to improve the system itself to enhance their ability to perform well and improve their job satisfaction and wellness. So we're quite excited that they're recognising that and wanting to move in that direction.
That's brilliant, Louise. It'd be exciting to hear some of that, more about that study. Right, it is now whatever hour it is, but the hour is up. So I just want to thank you all again for joining, and thank you particularly to Janet and Louise for some wonderful presentations that really kicked off a brilliant discussion between us all. So thank you all very much, and for everybody for contributing. So our next webinar is likely to be held in February next year, where we'll be exploring patient and family involvement in resilient healthcare with Harumi Chimura and Carolyn Canfield. So we will circulate details of that shortly. And yes, the video for this will be put onto the website. Once it's, we'll upload it onto the website so people can look back or watch it for the first time at a more reasonable hour of the day. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening or day, wherever it is that you are at the moment. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.